From the clock on the wall, it is 10 o'clock, and that means that class is about to start. As with everything we do, I know that many of you will continue to check in and say good morning. I just want to let you know that from this point on, I won't acknowledge it, but I do see them coming in because my phone is set up on my computer screen and I am watching you all coming in. So good morning to you. A couple of bits of information to explain and talk about. First, let me start with the pre-order of books. Okay, initially, you could only pre-order your book through Amazon. Amazon pretty much ships worldwide. So for all of you outside of the United States, that was really the only place, and that still is the only place you can order the book that can be shipped to you. And the reason why is my company doesn't ship out of the country. I know that sounds crazy, but it just has to do with logistics and something that we have to do. So we now offer the book on my website for advanced orders. These books will not show up and won't begin to be shipped until June. But if you buy the book through my website, the dinosaurgeorge.com website, then what we will do is when the books arrive, we're going to do a live book signing event where I am going to take those books, have your name, and I'm going to sign my name inside of your book to you, put it in an envelope, and we're going to mail it to you so you get an autographed copy of the book. But that is only for books that are ordered through my website, which is dinosaurgeorge.com. You cannot get it signed if you order from Amazon because I never see those books. Those books go straight from Amazon to you, and I don't ever see them. So if you want an autographed copy of my book, and this book is appropriate for ages like 4 to 6 because it's a first reader book. If you want an autographed copy, you can go to our website, dinosaurgeorge.com. You'll see the book on the homepage, or you can click on the catalog and you can order it there. Now, for those of you that want the book, but you live outside of the U.S., then the only option you've got is to order them through Amazon. And we have links for Amazon on our Dinosaur George Jr. page. I apologize. It's just I can't do anything else about that at this particular point, but we're working on it, okay? All right. So that's that. I also want to mention that we're still doing the live private lessons if you are interested. We did a couple yesterday. They were so much fun. It was an absolute blast. If you have your lesson before the end of May, the price is only $50. It's normally $125. So we have information about that as well on our Dinosaur George Jr. page. Now let's talk about the schedule. Here we go. The schedule for Tuesday, April 28th, it will be Dinosaur Mistakes and Errors. This one's going to be a lot of fun because in this one we talk about all of the different things that you often see or read about that are incorrect. And so we're going to talk about some of those. Friday, May 1st, it is pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, the pterodactyls. That one's going to be fun. And then for the class for May the 5th, we are going to let you vote for which topic you like the best. On the Dinosaur George Jr. page right now, scan through the page, you will find the poll. You can choose one of these 3 topics. Sauropods, where we talk about all the giant dinosaurs, the long necks. We can talk about evolution, which explains how plants and animals change over time. And then we can do one on piscivores, which are the fish-eating dinosaurs. And those are dinosaurs like Spinosaurus, Baryonyx, Suchomimus, and those. In order to vote, you have to click on the one you like the best. Don't just write at the bottom of the page which one you want, because we can't vote for you. There's nothing I can do. So make sure to click on the one that you want, okay? Make sure to click on the one that you want. And then whichever one gets the most votes, that's the one that will be the class, which will be held on May 5th. All right, legends and myths. How on earth do these things get started? Well, let me tell you something that I got to do a couple of years ago. I did a study once on prehistoric animals and their connection to myths and legends. And myself and a lot of other people believe that a lot of the legends you see and read about were started from people who saw fossils but didn't know what they were. we have to remember that at the time, in ancient times, when people came up with these ideas of legends and myths, they didn't have the internet to see if what they thought they knew. They didn't have books in some cases to read about them. All that they could do was hear stories from other people about that. So first I want to talk about, how do these stories of these animals begin? How do legends begin? So I'm going to create my own legend right now, and here we go. A man named Joe was fishing in a lake called Crystal Lake, and he caught that fish. Now, that's the fish that Joe caught. Not very big fish. When Joe got home and his family said, "Did you catch any fish, Joe?" Joe said, "Yes, I caught a pretty big fish." That's how big the fish really was. That's the fish Joe said he caught. So Joe said, "Yeah, I caught this big fish." And everybody said, "Wow, I didn't even know big fish like that lived in Crystal Lake." And Joe said, "Oh yeah, I caught it and it was that big, but I threw it back." Well, one of Joe's neighbors heard this, and he went and told a friend, "Did you guys hear about the fish that Joe caught in Crystal Lake? That fish was so big, Joe could hardly pick it up because it was so big, and it had big eyes and a big mouth." Well, that person heard the story and went to the nearby town and said, "Guys, this man named Joe caught this creature that lives in Crystal Lake that has great big eyes and a long whip-like tail, and it was a man-eater." And somebody in there heard that story and went and told a friend, "This guy named Joe caught a fish in Crystal Lake that was so big he could hardly pick it up." And somebody said, "I heard it was so big you couldn't even fit it in the boat." And then somebody said, "Did you guys hear the story about the monster in Crystal Lake? It takes 3 people to hold it up, and it looked like a giant sea serpent." And finally, for years, people talk about the legend of the Crystal Lake monster that lives in the depths of Crystal Lake and eats people. That's the legend of Crystal Lake Monster. Do you see what I mean about how these legends can start and how they perpetuate? Somebody says something, somebody hears something and changes the story a little, and little by little, these stories grow. That's how legends are started. So let's talk about some of the different legends that people believe in. First, let's talk about an animal they call the Griffin. Now, Greek authors used to write stories about a creature that lived in the Gobi Desert that had a beak like an eagle, it walked on 4 feet, and it had wings. Well, it turns out that in the Gobi Desert, there is a fossil that is found that is called a Protoceratops. Protoceratops have a beak like an eagle. They're found in the Gobi Desert. They walk on all 4s, and when you look at that long bone behind its neck that runs along the ribs, that's its shoulder. If you saw that and you didn't understand what that bone was, it would be easy for you in your imagination to believe that was a wing. So here is an example of where I think the legend of the Griffin started, because people were seeing the fossil bones of a dinosaur. And you have to remember that those bones are usually jumbled up, so they're not always together. So when somebody saw bones back then, they didn't know how the bones fit together. They had to guess. And in the case of the Griffin, I believe that is what started this legend. Let's go to the Cyclops. Here is an animal that was reported to have lived in the Mediterranean. They said it had one giant eye, it was huge, and it had these great, big, long teeth. Well, here's an image of a mammoth skull. Mammoths are found throughout the Mediterranean. Mammoths have a big hole in the center of their head where their trunk connects. That's not its eye. That is the trunk where the trunk connects. Next, absolutely it's giant. And could they have mistaken those long tusks as being teeth? Here we have a Cyclops. Here we have a mammoth. Do you see the connection between the two? Is it possible that the legend of a Cyclops started because people were finding the bones of mammoths, and in their imagination, they came up with, that must be a giant creature with one eye. So you have to remember, when these legends were started, people didn't travel all over the world. Most people didn't leave more than maybe 10 miles or 20 miles from their home. Most people stayed where they were. So it's not like a lot of people got to go to Africa to see elephants. It's not like a lot of those people got to go to India to see elephants. Those people at that time may have never seen an elephant in their life. And if you happened upon something like that, you would not stop and think of it as being an elephant because you don't know what an elephant is. So in my opinion, Cyclopses, the legend of Cyclopses was formed because people found the skull of mammoths. One of my favorites, the Yeti. Sometimes people call this Bigfoot, or what are some of the other names for it? Sasquatch. Now, the Yeti, the original giant ape-like creature, was first described by people from the Himalayas. That is kind of near the China border, the Himalayas. So they reported that this thing walked on two legs, that it had really long arms, that it was covered in fur, and that it was twice the size of a man. Now, that is the description that they used. Well, it turns out that scientists found the fossil remains of an animal called Gigantopithecus. This animal lived near the Himalayas. This was a giant ape, or some people believe a giant orangutan, and it would have been capable of standing up on two legs. It had long arms, it was covered in fur, and it was 10 feet tall. Now, the Gigantopithecus is not a legend. That's a real animal. So, is it possible that what people saw were the last remaining members of that family? People may have actually seen this animal. They may have actually seen live Gigantopithecus. And perhaps those stories get passed down through the generations. Here's something about the modern animals, like Sasquatch and Loch Ness Monster and those. Okay, there are a lot of people that say that they've seen those. I don't want to say that's not possible, because that's not what you should do in science. There are a lot of possibilities in science. The world is a big place. But here's what happens sometimes. Let's say after today's lesson, you guys get to go outside and you have a place where there's lots of trees. And your mind right now is thinking about Yetis. Let's talk about Sasquatch, Bigfoot. And you're thinking, the best part of today's class was learning about the Yeti. I think he's amazing. Okay. If something was in those woods, like a deer or a dog or a coyote or even a raccoon, and it moved very quickly and you only got a glimpse of it, your mind might convince you that you saw a giant hairy ape. It doesn't mean you didn't see it. It doesn't mean you're lying. It just means that that's what your mind tricked you into thinking. Now, again, let me make it clear. I'm not saying that it's not possible that an animal like a Yeti is alive today. I'm not saying that's not possible. But what I'm saying is sometimes our mind can trick us into believing something. And that also has to do with some of the different legends we're talking about. All right. This one is kind of interesting. This is stone snakes. Throughout Europe, people talked about finding stone snakes, snakes that had been turned to stone. They were coiled up. They were found all over the land. Well, what we believe they were looking at were animals called ammonites. They were not curled up snakes that had been turned to stone. Ammonites are animals that lived in a shell that lived in the ocean. But remember, when ammonites existed, the land that we find their shells on now was covered by ocean. So when the ocean receded, the fossils stayed where land is today. That's why we find sea creatures on land. They weren't walking onto land. Ammonites didn't crawl up onto land. They just died, and then the ocean went back. Well, the people living back then, they didn't understand that. They didn't know what we taught. They could not imagine that the ocean used to cover the land they were on. So during medieval time, people believed that they had found coiled snakes. And the early Roman Catholic religion has a deity called, or a saint called Saint Hilda or Saint Hild. And the legend is that Saint Hilda was able to turn all of the snakes in Europe to stone. You see a statue there. Look at the coiled snakes by her feet. Then the picture in the middle is where people used to actually find ammonites and carve the head of a snake at the end of it. They would actually find ammonites and carve the head of a snake because they believed that those stone snakes had been turned to stone by Saint Hilda or Saint Hild. Now, the other picture shows you what an ammonite really looked like. So the coiled stone snakes of legend were probably ammonites. And like I said, people even found them and carved the head of a snake at the end of it to turn it into a snake. Now let's talk about sea serpents. Since we're talking about water, let's talk about sea serpents. For the longest time, early sailors reported stories of giant sea creatures. Most of the time, they said they were very snake-like. Most of the time, they said they had really large teeth. Well, we learned about an animal during last week's class who kind of fits that bill. And that's an animal called a plesiosaur. Plesiosaur skeletons are found all along the shorelines throughout the world because they used to be covered by water, right? If you found the skeleton of an animal like that, who had that long neck and big flippers and big sharp teeth, it would be very easy for you to believe that those animals existed. Now, when I went up here at the beginning, let me see if I can find this again. This picture, remember this? That's called an oarfish. That's a real fish. That fish is alive today. The oarfish is a deep sea fish that humans rarely see. But what happens is when they get ready to die, they come into the shallow waters. We don't understand why, but that's what they do. So oarfish are truly a sea serpent, if that's what you want to call it. But here's something else to think. Remember, I don't want to say that none of this is possible. Let me say this about sea monsters. Okay, when sailors used to sail the ocean using oars or sails, their ships were made of wood. And the only sound the ship made was the sound of water splashing against the wood. That's not an unusual sound. Animals that live in the ocean can hear sound farther away than people living on land can hear sound. So, if you were a giant squid, let's say a squid called Architeuthis, because that's a squid that's alive today. Let's say it's at night and a giant squid is up near the surface. It's been catching fish. And it's sitting there minding its own business when suddenly a ship runs into it. Its first reaction is to assume that it is a whale. And its first reaction is to defend itself by using its tentacles to grab onto the whale to try to defend itself, to hold it away. Well, I believe that those kind of things may have happened during the early times when humans were first sailing the sea. Because again, remember, they were only using the wind or oars to move their ships, and their ships didn't make much noise because it was water splashing against wood. And again, that's not that strange of a sound. But people stopped reporting sea monsters when people started using mechanized engines. They started using engines. Once those engines started to be using to move a boat with a propeller, the sound can be heard from a long way away. So it may be possible that at night you have sea monsters, today's modern sea monsters like giant squid, who stay up near the surface at night because they come up from the depths during the night to catch fish. It could be that because we're using boats that are making a lot of sound, those giant squid hear the boat long before the boat sees them, and they dive down and they don't have any contact with it. You know, over and over, we hear stories of people in sailing boats that leave and are never heard from again. Some people believe it could be bad weather. Some believe it could be rogue waves, a big wave. But maybe the possibility exists that there are still sea serpents today. It's just that they are animals that we would not think of as being a sea serpent, whales included. But I do believe that plesiosaurs could have very well have made an impact on that. And now for one of my favorite subjects of all. I told you guys at the very beginning that a couple of years ago, I did a study where I studied mythological animals and fossils that may have been mistaken for them. And one of my favorite was an animal called the Thunderbird. Throughout the southwest of the United States, and I believe in other parts of the world, I believe the Mayans and the Aztecs, they all talk about a giant bird they called the Thunderbird. We see images of it. We see they drew paintings of it on walls. They weaved it into fabric. They painted it on pots. The Thunderbird was a very important animal. Well, this was probably 20 years ago, maybe longer than that. No, I bet it was longer than that. I bet it's 30 years ago. I lived in Arizona, and I got to meet a chief from a Pima Indians. The Pima Indians is a local Indian tribe where I lived. I lived in Scottsdale. I knew that they had a reservation there. I was able to meet with the chief of the Pima Indian tribe, and I asked him about the Thunderbird. And I said, can you tell me the stories that you were told when you were a child? And here's what he told me. He said, okay, the Thunderbird only came to Arizona once a year. It came once a year. We were terrified of it because this thing was big enough to pick up children or pick up small animals. It could pick them up and fly off with them, and it did. And he said, my people were terrified of it, but they viewed it as a god because this bird was so big. When it flapped its wings, it caused lightning and thunder, and it brought rain with it. So they said it came once a year, it brought the rain with it, and it brought thunder and lightning, and it was so big, and he said it was as big as 3 buffalo. That's what he told me. It was as big as 3 buffalo. Now, he never saw it, but his ancestors told him about it. So they believed that there was a god called the Thunderbird, and they feared it, but respected it, because it brought rain with it. Well, in Argentina, they discovered a giant bird called Argentavis. Argentavis is 30 feet across. It is a gliding bird. It's not a bird that has to flap its wings all the time. It can glide on something called a thermal. A thermal is where heat from the ground goes up into the air like a spiral, and birds like modern vultures and condors can open their wings and glide for hundreds and hundreds of miles with the warm air keeping them in the air. They don't use any energy. They don't have to flap. They can even sleep if they want. They can sleep while they're flying. So when I discovered that Argentavis was a real thing, I found out where he comes from. He comes from Argentina. Argentavis comes from Argentina. So then, while I was living in Arizona, shortly after the Indian chief told me the story, we had something they call the monsoon season, which is the rain season, the flood season. I used to laugh when I first moved there because I kept seeing these notices on the news about beware of low water crossings. And I'm like, I live in a desert. There's no water out here. Well, I didn't know that the monsoon season is in a tremendous amount of rain. So I thought, wait a minute. So once a year, you get these giant rainstorms? Yes. So I met with a meteorologist. That's a person who studies weather. I met with a meteorologist from Arizona, and I said, what happens with these monsoons? He said, here's what happens. The monsoons start in South America, and they begin to build in the climate. And the monsoon then moves from South America up through Central America, up through Mexico, and ultimately into Arizona. And they dump a lot of rain, and then the winds continue back and go towards California, and that's it. And I said, does any wind from California travel to South America? He goes, yeah, there's a jet stream. So what if this? What if Argentavis, who lived in South America, when the monsoons began, what if it used the thermals ahead of the storm to travel into new hunting grounds where it could travel without using any sort of energy? It would be flying ahead of the storm. If you lived in Arizona and right before the storm hit, you see a bird that is the size of 3 buffaloes in the sky, wouldn't you believe that maybe that bird was causing the lightning and thunder and bringing the rain because it's a god? Is that possible? By the way, how big is 3 buffaloes? They are exactly 30 feet long, the length of Argentavis. How cool is that? Maybe it's possible that the early Native American Indians in North America actually saw the last of a giant species of bird that we know existed. You don't know. That's the greatest thing about legends. That to me is the best part. And of all of the legends that ever existed, it is dragons who we love. Dragons are the most amazing legends of all. I love them. Now, there were so many different kinds of dragons. I simply don't have time to talk about all the different kinds. So the only dragons I'm going to talk about are the very first ones that people in different countries reported. That's the ones we're going to focus on today. I know. And here is your homework for today. I want you to find a legendary animal and either draw a picture and put it on the Dinosaur George Facebook, Dinosaur George Jr. Facebook page, or post a picture of it. It can be whichever you want. If it's a dragon, put a picture of a dragon. If you have a toy dragon, take a picture. Do you have a picture of a dragon? Put pictures. If it's the unicorn, which I love. I wasn't able to fit unicorns in this class. I want you to post a mythological animal on our page. And while we're speaking about homework, I want to give you a shout out. Michelle reminded me this morning to remind you how proud we all are here at the Dinosaur George Company of all of you that are doing so much great work on your homework. Your beautiful work, your drawings, your reports. We love, love, love to see your post on our page. So that's your homework for today. Post a picture of something to do with a mythological animal. And right now your mom is like, I'll tell you a mythological animal. It's the legend of my husband who is supposed to clean out the garage but never does. That's a legend. That doesn't exist. So I'm going to put a picture of my husband because he will not. All right, let's talk about dragons. Now, the very first dragons that people reported, they said they had a long snake-like body. They were covered in scales, and their heads had horns and spikes, and their noses were so big they believe fire may have come out. Well, where did something like that begin? Well, let's start with dinosaur skeletons. And by the way, the first dragons that were reported that I'm aware of happened in Asia. And Asia is where a lot of dinosaur bones are found. So, look at the pictures of these dinosaur skeletons. What happens a lot of time when a dinosaur dies is carnivores will take away pieces and parts. You see, if a dinosaur dies and you're a carnivore and you show up, you want to pull off a piece and you want to get out of there because there may be bigger carnivores coming, right? You don't want to stay there and eat there because somebody may bigger than you may come along and eat you. So If you see a big dinosaur laying there, the first thing you want to do is rip off an arm or a leg, because those are the easy parts to remove. And so you rip off arms and legs and you get out of there. So what ends up happening a lot of times is you can see these long lines of bones from animals. See the picture on the top left where the man is digging up? Imagine if the bones out to the side were not there and it was only all of those neck, back, and tail vertebrae. If you didn't know what a dragon was, or if you didn't know what a dinosaur was, you might think that belongs to an animal. And if its big arms and legs have been removed, then all that's left sometimes is maybe just the humerus, maybe just the upper arm bone sticking out. So if that's the only thing you see, then you might think, well, that must be a leg, but it's tiny. So when you see these images of dragons, they may have these small little feet and legs. So dragons, I believe, were because people were seeing dinosaur bones who didn't know what they were. And now you want to see something cool? Now remember what I said. People back then did not know what these fossils were. I'm going to show you a picture of real dinosaur scales. Are you ready for this? This is incredible. You are going to see a picture of real dinosaur skin. Look at the scales of, I'm sorry, dragon. These are actually dragon scales. These are the scales from dragons. Look at that. Okay, you really want to know what you just looked at? You just looked at pictures of fossilized plants. But look at them. Look at them again. If you didn't know what a fossil was, if you didn't know anything about a fossil and you saw that, wouldn't you think that that's the skin of some kind of animal? So why is it that dragons always have the scaly skin? I believe it could be simply because they are finding things like fossilized plants. That's giving them the idea of the scaly skin. And now we get to the head, coolest part of a dragon. Why do they always have horns and bumps and blowing fire from their mouth? I think it's because of things like this. This is the skull of a dinosaur named Stygimoloch. I'm sorry, this is Draco Rex. This is the skull of Draco Rex. That is a real dinosaur skull. It's not a sculpture. That's the real thing. When you look at the image, of that dragon with that long nose and the horns on back of its head, it would be very, very easy for you to believe if you saw this in the ground that that is some kind of dragon. And why do they have the fire breathing? Here's some other examples. Look at the size of the nose on the one on the right, the nostril. Look at the size of the nostril. Now, the reason why that dinosaur has that big nose is it helped it with its sense of smell. But if you did not know anything about dinosaurs and you were walking through the desert and you saw that in the ground, it would be very, very easy for you to believe that that belonged to a creature, and then in your mind you could figure out what the creature looked like. Look at the picture on the left. If you saw that, you might think that thing is a dragon. And one thing about people that has never changed, it's our ability to exaggerate the truth. Remember a picture of our fish? Remember our little fish? Remember the fish that Joe caught in Crystal Lake? And when he told his family about it, he pretended it was bigger than it really was. And remember our fish went from that to that, all because of exaggeration and imagination? I think the same thing could have happened with dragons, because first, saying you saw a dead dragon would be cool. But what if you told everybody in your little village that you killed it and you protected everybody? And what if you brought back a dragon tooth in your hand to prove what happened? Well, people back then couldn't prove or disprove what you said. They might be so amazed by your story, they go to the next village and tell the story of the fire-breathing monster. And in the next village, they said, oh, yeah, we have one of those too, only ours can fly. So dragons could be the cause of that. And here is one more image of a dinosaur. Now, this dinosaur sort of looks like a dragon, but he looks like something else. He was named after another mythological animal, an animal called the Minotaur. This is a dinosaur called Minotaurus. Minotaurus. Now, let me say this. That particular dinosaur was found in China, not in Greece. I believe that in Greece the legend of the Minotaur started. But I just want to show you that scientists recognize that some fossils look a lot like some legends look a lot like things that are fossilized. So much so, they were even willing to name an actual discovery off of a mythological animal and called it Minotaurosaurus. Your homework for today. Your job is to go out and find something to do with a mythological animal and post it to the Dinosaur George Jr. page. Remember the upcoming schedule. You've got classes coming up April the 28th, May the 1st, and May the 5th. We will do whichever class gets the most votes. Please, please, please make sure to click on the one you like the best. Don't just write at the bottom. Don't just write at the bottom which one you want. You can write comments at the bottom. You can talk about it. But remember, if you don't actually click on it, you don't actually cast a vote. And so once we get closer to the May 5th date, I will announce what it's going to be. All right. With that, class is dismissed. Now I will hang around and answer questions. And I hope you enjoyed today's lesson on dragons, legends, and myths. And again, post some pictures.